Thank you for watching or listening to Light Up with Shwa. This is part 2 with Dr. Shehzad Salim. Please enjoy. Thank you.
So I think this is a very important area that needs some ability and expertise to hear out each other and accommodate each other. But I think the crux of the matter, we must understand that crux of the matter, that scriptures like the Old Testament and the Final Testament, which is the Quran, they have certain verses, certain paragraphs in them which have this very harsh content. For example, we find the Quran telling us that you have to slay the idolaters, or not make friends with the people of the book, or like not pray for them, ask for forgiveness for the idolaters. And then there are several other verses, very similar ones in the Old Testament also, which are very similar to the Quran as well. So it's the scripture which is actually breeding this mindset in which certain responsibilities which were given to the prophets of God, they are thought to be practices which we as Muslims, as non-prophets, not prophets of God, we have the prerogative to express them and follow them as well. So the thing is that when Mullah Omar or Osama bin Laden or people who have these extremist views, they come up and say that, okay, I find inspiration from the Quran, and look what the Quran says. And so therefore I'm now going to start killing people, or as you would be knowing that there was a time in the late 90s or early 90s when Osama bin Laden actually said that he quoted a Quranic verse and said that enemy number one, or the kafir number one, is the United States, and I'm going to really give them something. So what is happening here is, and I would say this is the crux of the matter, that scriptural verses and certain hadith narratives are being quoted in favor of this extremist attitude and this mindset. And in my humble capacity, I have done some work through the education I got from my own teachers. And I have written a small book which is called Playing God, actually, which means that we are trying to play the role of God without realizing that we were not given this role. It was these harsh verses have a particular background in the Quran, and they have a particular context, and they cannot be invoked by non-prophets. I mean, people who are not prophets of God, people who are not messengers of God. So messengers of God are given certain prerogatives, they are given certain duties, and they are acting on behalf of God. It's like God being there. Just as God, we cannot blame God if he takes away my mother or father because this is his will. In a similar way, this happened on earth in the lifetime of certain messengers of God, that God decided the fate of certain people in this world because they were guilty of intentionally denying the truth. Now, these are very important words, intentionally denying the truth.
Yes.
After the departure of the prophets of God and the termination of the institution of Wahi, we cannot know whether a particular person is denying out of his intention or because maybe he's not being given the right information. Maybe he's confused. Maybe he still wants to know the truth. So we have to make this distinction between the prophetic period. I call the prophetic period the period which started from Adam and ended on Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then we have the post-prophetic era, which began with the death of the last prophet and is going to continue to the last day. The first the period, which is the prophetic period, has a special feature which is mentioned in the Quran, in which the fate of the nations which existed in the time of the messengers of God is decided by God through these messengers in their times, so that this can become a visual proof that one day, just as judgment has taken place of these nations on this earth, one day each one of us will be held accountable for our deeds on the day of judgment. So it's like a visual proof, an empirical evidence for the day of judgment. So this has been enshrined in the Quran. Unfortunately, instead of drawing a lesson from it, we try to practically adopt it, and we invest ourselves with the same powers which actually God had or his messengers had. And these harsh verses also have this particular background. Of course, I cannot go into more details here, but just a question that the scripture, and precisely the same thing has happened with the Old Testament also, because Moses had a very similar milieu and a very similar environment in which he conducted himself as a prophet. So we have to realize that scriptures, wherever they have these strong verses in them, harsh verses in them, they have a specific context, and they relate to the prophetic era. But by not making this distinction, we have actually extended their import and have made them applicable to us as well.
Isn't it also partly the interpretation that we do?
So as I said, this is the interpretation area, because what has happened is that these verses of the Quran have been interpreted as if we have the same prerogatives and the same duties as messengers of God. You see, one of the verses of the Quran says that in the life of the Prophet, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ, which means in the life of the Prophet is the best example for you. So what they do is they say, okay, if since he's the best example, so we have to follow him in every sphere.
Yeah.
So if he fought, we have to fight. If he did this, we have to do this, without realizing that as an exemplary character, the area which the Quran is actually pointing out here is the moral part, is the part in which we have to become an extremely good human being, an extremely good Muslim. The battles which the Prophet fought, or the wars that he waged, were governed by a specific law which is meant for the prophets of God, for the messengers of God, and for none else, for not like people like you and me.
Yeah, exactly.
So that is the, I would say, the crux of the matter, and that is where
a very
we
high
have gone.
important point you have mentioned. Thank you so much. I think this should be talked about as much and as widely, because this is a point that I think in our common Muslim communities we also don't realize.
Right, we don't realize this.
Yeah. So, anything else before I go to it?
Well, I think this is the area in which we need to educate our youth. We need to hold these small Quranic explanatory sessions in which you see, while living in the US and teaching and interacting with children, the biggest, I would say, insult that our Muslims face is that they are terrorists. And instead of perhaps having an answer to it, they just get depressed or they get reactionary. So the right way is to come up with an answer.
Yes.
People are calling you terrorists. I mean, what they are doing is they are, of course, doing an injustice because it is a small minority which is doing their terrorism. But even then, because we are representatives of the same faith, so it's like a broad insult that we have to face. We are facing what other people on our behalf are doing. But the thing is that instead of reacting badly on this insult, let's sit together and find out why is it that Muslims become such terrorists. After all, a lot of these terrorists are very pious individuals. I know them. I have known many of them. They are very, very pious individuals. So what leads a pious individual to become a militant, an extremist, a terrorist? There has to be something that we must analyze and get down to it. And in a very similar tone, I often say that these caricatures which have become famous in Denmark and in Europe, this cartoon controversy is something also that instead of reacting on that controversy, or instead, of course, we do have our emotions attached, and that is something which is better said than done. But the thing is that let's make a concerted effort to find out that if they are making fun of us, then there is some substance in that. Let me give you a small example. We know that, as is reported in our history, that Aisha, one of the wives of the Prophet, was reportedly 8 or 9 years old when she got married. So one of the cartoons actually depicts this and says that how can an elderly person marry someone who maybe is eligible to be his or her grandchild? So this is the problem that plagues their mind, and this comes out from their minds in the form of a insult, or in the form of a caricature, in the form of a cartoon. So instead of reacting to that cartoon, it's much better to understand, did the Prophet really marry a 7 or 8 year old? And if he did, then what was the reason? So it's like communicating that reason. It's like opening up a dialogue. You see, one of the problems which plagues us Muslims, especially religious minds, is that we become emotional. We become reactionary. The thing is that we have to open up the gates to dialogue. We have to give this message to the world that it's at times things are not what they seem, and we have to agree to disagree. There are things which we think are not properly reported in history. There are other things in which we think that the stance of religion has not been reported properly. So let's sit down and talk to each other. And I blame Muslims more than the non-Muslims, because they are the ones who react very badly. And it is here that we must stop this emotional outburst and be more rational and intellectual in our approach.
Thank you. So let's start with something that is common in Islam and other faiths.
The biggest thing which is common is this belief that we are the progeny of one man and woman. We are the progeny of one husband and wife. We are the progeny of Adam and Eve. I think this is such a huge concept, and the Quran has actually alluded to this, and it says that we have created you, O mankind, from a single pair of male and female. Inna khalaqnakum min zakarin wa unsa. So it's telling us that you are one family, And I think this lesson has been forgotten by us.
Yeah.
And we have created our own niches, our own separate clans and identities. It's not bad to have a clan or identity, but when you make that clan a means of becoming superior, or you think that you are superior to the other, that's something which is extremely bad. And here I would like to point out one more thing, and that is this general misperception that Islam has a very harsh stance, or maybe a very derogatory stance in some cases with women as well, because there are certain directives apparently which have this ring of as if women are inferior to men, or maybe as if they are secondary to men. But let me tell you, in my research of about 25 years, I have also a small publication on this subject that not only does exactly, so you already have that.
Yes.
So I have. It's not only the fact that we are the progeny of men of the same husband and wife. The other thing is that as individuals, as male and female, we have the same respect that each of us deserves. Neither the man is superior from the woman, nor it's vice versa. It's the same. As human beings, all of us have the same stature, and we deserve the same respect. And this, unfortunately, is another lesson that we have forgotten, that we look down upon women just as we look down upon non-Muslims. It is as if they are the two sides of the same coin. And this has led to such a big divide and such a big misperception regarding what religion is that it's hard to say.
But also there is a little contradiction that at the same time the mother is really revered, and mother has the Jannah under her feet and all that. So that also that mother is the same woman, that female gender.
So what happens is that reverence is given to the mother, but the opposite behavior is adopted with the wife. So this is one of the areas in which we need to work, that two institutes, that number one, as a global human family, all of us are equal, all of us are human beings, and we must stay connected with each other. And the second point is that as far as men and women are concerned, as human beings, they are totally equal. Let me relate to you this incident which happened about, I think, a couple of decades ago. The Time magazine published an issue in which it said that the Qur'an was the greatest revolutionary of its own times because it gave certain powers to women which they never had before them. And the implication which they were actually making was that although it was a revolutionary in its own times, now it's no longer that revolutionary, and the directives it contains they are so backward, or maybe so anti-revolutionary or anti-revolutionary, that this needs another revolution, further step ahead. So the point they were making is that although it was something very revolutionary in its own times, but now, after 14 centuries, this no longer is the case, because the world is far ahead from the Quran, or gone ahead than the Quran. And again, I think this has happened because many precepts of the Quran, or many directives of the Quran, the way they have been portrayed, unfortunately, they are not what the Quran actually says. They are either culture or history or our own perception.
There is no difference between culture and the faith.
One of the biggest things which has amalgamated, or I would say besmeared the face of Islam, is that we have not separated it from culture, and we have not distinguished it from historical happenings, and we have not made it distinct from what my or your perception is, and we regard our interpretation or our perception to be the right Islam, without realizing that it can have different interpretations, because human intellect is different everywhere. My own interpretation is something for which I am liable to. I must not make the other person liable to my interpretation. He or she is liable to what he or she thinks. So this is one of the biggest mix-ups, I would say, that in many areas we mix culture with religion, in many areas we mix history with religion, and in many areas we make a mess out of these interpretations, and we try to impose our interpretation on the other person.
Thank you. Very rich and very important. Let's go to briefly, if you can say, this is now that we are on this topic, how it is interpreted and all. If you can you talk about Sharia in some lines so that it is understood by Muslims also and by non-Muslims? That what is Sharia that they are afraid of?
Right. So Sharia basically is the name of divine law. You see, the Quran has revealed certain guidelines, certain principles, which are presented as guidelines, I would say, as rules, as principles, as regulations that we need to follow. And they are very few, they are very precise, as statutes, as rules and principles ought to be. They are like a couple of liners. And the system that should be evolved on the basis of those principles is left to each country, to each society, to each era of time. Because it's like saying that we have to follow a particular principle, but the model of following that principle can vary from place to place. So the Sharia is just a set of rules which the Almighty has revealed to mankind so that they can spend their lives in this world as better individuals, as more contributing individuals. And this Sharia, basically, as I said, is very succinct, it's very precise, and it can be actually laid down in the form of bullet points. So because these are guidelines. So this is what the Quran has actually done. And again, the derivation of certain details from those guidelines is a human endeavor, and it has been left to us. And that is why there's always a chance of variation. There's always a chance of difference of opinion, which we have to accept. And as I said, as long as we hold to those principles, the interpretation of those principles is always something which God has allowed us to do, as long as we have the competence to interpret those principles, and that is all. The problem is that what we have done is that we have equated man-made laws with divine laws. We have equated the interpretation of Sharia to the Sharia itself. So it's like equating the interpretation of the Constitution of the United States with the Constitution itself. Interpretation is something which is done after that. It is done on that. It is something of an understanding. So what we have done is we have given the same divine status to the interpretation of the Sharia as the Sharia itself has, which is of course not right. Because interpretation is not done by God, it is done by human beings.
Yeah.
The Sharia is given by God. So the Sharia is divine, but the interpretation is not divine. It's a human endeavor, and hence we have to give it due regard. We cannot equate it to the divine Sharia. And today what happens, or what has been actually happening in the last millennium, I would say, in the Muslim world, is that the interpretation of the Sharia, which has been done by human beings, has been given the same reverence or the same status as the Sharia given by God Himself. Yeah. And this has caused such a big mess that we have not yet actually come out of it. And if you ask me, we are going deeper into it because we are not making this distinction.
Yes.
That we have to keep the two separate. One is the divine and one is the temporal.
Yeah. And I think Muslims are missing, and we have to really evaluate how much time we have spent with the revealed text in our lifetime. So have we done 23 years? Anything close to that?
Even if we spend 23 minutes a day, that would be a lot of time.
Exactly.
The thing is that we don't find time for the scripture.
Yes.
So finding time for the scripture, because you see, the biggest asset that I have is my God connection.
Yeah.
That strength of the connection is my asset. And the way to build up that connection is to have a connection with the scripture, because the biggest manifestation of the divine is the word that He has sent.
Nowadays, parents are very concerned in the US and the Western world about their children, that they are distancing themselves from those who are followers of Islam, from being a Muslim or Islamic tradition or Qur'an and Islam. So what do you have to say to the parents or the youth? Like, how should we manage that situation, which is happening quite a bit, and we are lost in that?
I think this is a very important and a very good question that you have raised, and I just have one answer to this, and I think that if we pay heed perhaps to this, then the task before us would become a lot easier. And that is that when we would like to educate our children regarding Islam and the imports of Islam or the precepts of Islam, we must not impose Islam on the children as if they have to follow something. We must reason it out to them. We must tell them that if, for example, Islam wants us to fast in Ramadan, or it wants us to pray 5 times a day, or it has prohibited us to consume liquor or pork, then what is the reason behind it? Because you see, the reason is based in the Quran on common sense, on a certain rationale. Because I do think that if we communicate that rationale to our next generation, even to Muslims of our own contemporary era, it is a line of communication that we can adopt, and this is something which can, if we adopt the proper reasoning, it can really be communicated. Because you see, the Quran says that whatever it has presented to us has to be weighed in the scales of reason. And the Almighty has tried to communicate it on the basis of reason, and He expects us to communicate it further on the basis of the same, which is reasoning, to other people. So instead of forcing our children to get up early in the morning to pray Fajr and telling them off or taking them off or not doing so, let's start and sit with them and tell them why are Muslims called to prayer, or they are asked to pray 5 times a day. What is the rationale behind praying?
Well, that will demand them to be educated and them to make sure that they are conscious of it.
Absolutely. So the first thing is that the parents need to get themselves educated on these things, and also give time to their children. So I would sum it up by saying that instead of teaching Islam or religion as a dogma, let's teach it as a discipline.
Okay.
For example, when you teach physics or chemistry or a certain science to a child or to a grown-up, what do? You present the reasoning in favor of a particular theory.
Yep.
And you tell the reasoning, the counter reasoning which other people might have. And this is how human mind works. It grasps that reasoning, adopts that reasoning, or criticizes that reasoning. So in a similar way, instead of dogmatically enforcing religion, we must present the reasoning behind a certain statute, and of course brace ourselves as well regarding that reasoning.
That's right. Thank you. I would like, because you are from Pakistan, and I guess you are also a transnational or a multinational or cultural person, coming to a bit to Pakistanis in general, what have you found something that Pakistani parents have some good practices and some that are not so good?
As I said earlier on, the biggest drawbacks of our Pakistani parents is not realizing the pressures which children go through when they are in their age. They don't realize the peer pressure. They don't realize the mindset of a growing up child. So instead of living with the child, instead of making friends with the child, instead of trying to understand the problems which the child might be going through, they are more dictators. They are more enforcers.
So
of
you
their
were
will.
talking about this for Pakistani parents, not in general.
I said that I think that this is particularly true of Pakistani parents and the third world countries.
Yeah.
But in the first world also, we find glimpses of this attitude in certain areas. Although what happens here is that because at a very early age, children have this liberty to move away from their parents, so they don't get the brunt of that nasty attitude, and because this I would say value of freedom and liberty has the greatest show in the West, because the biggest thing that you can show off is that you are free and you have the liberty to do whatever you like. So it has actually gone to the other extreme. So as I said, that as common sense would also say, that extremes are always something which breed further extremes. If you have an extremist attitude, it's going to breed an extremist attitude from the people who come into your contact. And so, as Aristotle has always said, it's the golden mean that we have to go after. It's the golden mean that is the real thing, the moderate view, the moderation that we have, the thing which is always in between, the mean between the extreme. That is the right way. And there's always a mean between two extremes. And it's just a question of striking that balance. As human beings, we have this proclivity of shifting and tilting the balance and going in one direction. So the right way is to perhaps this thing what I call as self-control. Self-control is this power which takes you closer towards what the golden mean is, what the in-between behavior is. It is this unbridled behavior which actually is a means of taking you to the two extremes. If we have self-control, if we have self-discipline, if we conquer our inner desires, and we are able to steer our own selves the way we would like to, that is the key towards moderation and that golden mean. And that is the way that we should present ourselves. And by the way, as you started off with this life coaching, I think one of the greatest objectives of this life coaching is to make you balanced individuals, is to make you moderate individuals, and to make you realize that extreme behavior is never something a given or a good behavior, because it's going to take you nowhere. You might be doing something very good for a small period of time because you're doing it in a very extreme way. But if you divide it on your whole life, it will be, in fact, counterproductive. It may be counterproductive to what you do.
So before we end this segment, I want you to tell me something that Americans should know about Pakistanis in a cordial and amicable way that they are missing on knowing about Pakistan, and something that Pakistanis should know about Americans, because you do travel, something that you think that they are missing the information that is good about each other.
When Pakistanis come to the US, they become disciplined and they become individuals who follow the rules, because the tradition here is that it's your second nature to follow rules. It's like part of your personality, because as soon as you open your eyes, you find the whole environment following a certain discipline. So I think the biggest lesson which the third world countries should learn or know about these first world countries, or maybe individuals or children from the United States, is that it becomes so easy when you go to a society which follows certain rules and a set of rules to be amongst them, because it's like you don't need to actually exercise any extra effort, because the whole drive is in that direction. And the respect for the rule of law is something which Muslims or people from Pakistan should learn when they come to Western societies, that it's the respect for the rule of law which is so prevalent, and to be able to come together as compassionate individuals. And the two things which stand out in these Western societies is, one of them I call the thank you culture, and the other one is I call the sorry culture. Thank you culture is that you're always thanking the other person, and you're always apologizing to the other person. It's such a beautiful thing, that I'm sorry for that and thank you very much. So these are the three things I think that perhaps they can really learn. And the things which Americans perhaps can learn from societies like Pakistan are these family values, the closeness of a family, the warmth of a father and a mother, or a grandparent. Because it is here that we find in the West that there are so many families which are now single-parent families. Very, very tragically, at a very early age, we find single-parent families, and this actually deprives the child of some of the traits which have to be transferred from the other gender. And that's how at times they become incomplete individuals. Fortunately, in Pakistan or in many other Muslim countries, we still have that bonding, we still have that family culture in which we can depend on our family, in which we can count on them, in which we can become closer to them. Although I might dare say this, that this is breaking now, even in the East as well. We are finding some cracks and some fissures there as well, but still the fabric is very much intact. Although it's deteriorating, although it might, in the next 10 or 15 years, a lot might change. But even in these changing circumstances, they still have a lot of very strong familial ties. And it's not that the US or the Western societies don't have that, because here also we have very strong family bonds and very strong family relationships in many parts of the US. It's only because of the fact that children move out of their houses at a very early time, and this independence which comes to them at a very early age, this sort of weakens that family bond. And it makes a person more, if I use the word with respect, it makes a person more selfish and more self-centered. And in spite of the fact that they are still selfless in many other areas, because the way people behave here is that they are very selfless. But in matters of relationships, they become slightly more selfish. And perhaps it is here that they can learn something from Pakistanis.
Yes, thank you. Going back to that, if you can say something about why is it happening in Pakistan, those family relations are weakening. Do you have anything on that? Do you have any research or your experience?
I think there are two things.